Hi everyone, I hope you are enjoying Quilt Club Week of 2021 and all of the classes that we had loaded in the portal for you. Let us know what is your favorite one and what you've learned, and don't forget to go to Quilt Club Week for your Facebook page so that you can comment and talk with other people who are having a good time here with Quilt Club Week also. So for our live lecture today, I have some antique quilts for you and some stories to go with them, and also some fun and interesting facts. So we're going to start first with this one, and my little paper is entitled Fabric Making and Fun Facts. So we're going to start way back in 1752. There was an Irishman named Francis Nixon, and he developed a technique for engraving copper plates to print fabric. So we have to have these plates or these rolls or tubes or wheels to have the design on them so that you can actually print on the fabric. So that happened in 1752. Another man, Christopher Philippe Oberkrom, sets up a factory near in France and creates a popular toile in America. So in the early 1800s, there was a toile fabric that was what most of the fabric used, whether it was in the home deck, you can see a lot of it in the southern plantations, or they would use it and actually cut it up, and that was like their applique. There was a toile, and then there also was a chintz. Now, in 1761, George Washington sends an invoice to an English merchant with directions to pay for Mrs. Washington's order for a Marseilles quilting. I'm not sure what that is, but George Washington knew that it was important to his wife, and so he got that paid for. In 1774, Britain feuds and passes a law that no machinery could be exported to America that would weave or print cotton fabrics, and the selvages would identify the fabric origin. So I think that's really cool that our selvages today still give you information about that fabric, about where it was made, who made it, who designed it, all of that. And that started in 1774 because Britain was afraid that America was going to start weaving their own textiles, their own garments, and they were right. We were very close to it. An unknown man opens a calico cotton print shop in Philly. I thought that was kind of interesting. So maybe that was the first quilt shop, was in Philadelphia in the mid 1770s. In 1772, America chooses the eagle as a national symbol, and quilters use it in designs. You could actually find eagles kind of appliqued onto the fabric, and then they also were printing eagles in their fabric, which I think is pretty cool because I've got my new 250-year birthday celebration for America, and we have got eagles in our fabric. Now, in 1793, the cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney. Now, there's an interesting story that I learned as I was doing some different tours through the South and at some of the different plantations. I think I actually learned this when I was in Savannah. Eli was on a ship, and he was kind of in between things in his life. And when you would take a ship down the East Coast, it could take you several weeks to get where you were going. So he met a man on the boat who happened to be an old acquaintance that he had, and they struck up their friendship, reunited it again, and had plenty of time to talk on the boat, on the ship. And he convinced Eli to come with him and get off the ship there in Savannah. So he did, and he was at one of the parties, and that was at one of the plantations. And the lady that owned the plantation realized that Eli had some accounting schooling, and her husband had passed away, and she was running the plantation, and she needed some help with the accounting and the bookwork. So she convinced Eli to stay at her plantation and help her run her business. Now, one day Eli was taking a break, and he went out walking across the plantation, and he saw where they were doing what they called carding the cotton. So when they picked the cotton, there's a big fat seed in there, and that seed is really very heavily, I'm going to use the word woven into those cotton fibers. It was very hard to pick those seeds out. So they would put it on kind of like two big hairbrushes or paddles, and they would put the cotton on there, and they would card it. They would do it like this until they could get the seeds out of it. And he thought about how labor intensive it was, that the carding of the cotton was harder to do than any of the growing or the picking or the harvesting or anything else that, you know, the cotton fibers went through. So he kept thinking about that, about how that was the most labor intensive thing. Now, at that time, slavery was about to go away. They were using slaves mostly with tobacco. They were using them some with the cotton, but they were just about to go away. And so, and a lot of the slave labor was used for the carding of the cotton. So one day, Eli was back walking across the plantation again, and he noticed that one of the plantation cats was on one side of the chicken coop, and of course the chickens were on the other side, and the cat had his claws, and he was going through the wires of the chicken coop trying to get the chicken, and all he was getting was a few feathers here and there. And that gave Eli the idea of how to make the cotton gin, about how to gin the cotton and get the seeds out. So Eli went to work on making that cotton gin, and that's really what he's probably most famous for. But something else that Eli did is that he is the one that actually started the assembly line, and this was in the North. He started an assembly line method of actually manufacturing guns. We think that Ford did it with his car manufacturing, but Eli actually had done it first with a synchronized method of putting the guns together, about making firearms. And I think it's really ironic that he did the firearm manufacturing, and then he also did the cotton gin. And without the cotton gin, I think slavery would have just completely died out from what I've studied around that time. But now, because it was faster to process the cotton and get it into those big bales and get it to the mills to where the cotton fabric was made, that people needed more help. They needed more labor. And so slavery actually took an uptick after that time. So then, of course, the Civil War came, and you know, to me, it's like you've got the guns of the North with the manufacturing, and then fighting against the other part of what Eli did with the gin. So it's kind of ironic there, I think, with the history of Eli. So now back to 1812. The War of 1812 created patriotic themes in cloth designs. And in 1846, we talked about this yesterday with the sewing machine, that Elias Howe was the one that put the patent on the sewing machine. And then in 1850, the thing that I love a lot is the check fabric. And so the check fabric was starting to be made, and that was in 1850. In 1851, Isaac Singer patented the first successful commercial sewing machine. And then in 1857, Mr. Gibbs of Virginia registered a patent for a chain stitch single thread sewing machine. And I'm not sure I had that in my report yesterday. When I was reading it today, I thought I need to double check that about Mr. Gibbs. But in 1860, now this is kind of cool. I thought this was real unusual. In 1860, homespun parties are organized in the South to promote Southern independence, political and patriotic sewing themes. So I guess I thought, you know, like a Tupperware party or a Mary Kay party or whatever was kind of a new thing, but apparently they had homespun parties back in 1860, where they would get together and do the political and patriotic sewing themes. Now, in 1861, Abraham Lincoln's mother, Nancy Hanks, was known as an excellent seamstress. There was an article on her, and of course he was president in 1861, and so just like the news today, we'll go in and research something that has to do with the president to get a story. That's what they did, and they noted that she was an excellent seamstress. Now, in 1882, Danville develops a the textile industry. So 1882, that's really later than, the late 1700s, early 1800s was when the manufacturing started here in the United States. But the big Danville company developed a big textile industry. And I know when I first started buying fabric on my own, I remember the Danville name being on that edge of the fabric. In 1889, sewing machines were working very well and became more dominant, not only in the garment world, but also in quilting, piecing. And then quilt patterns started to be organized and commercially published in St. Louis Ladies' Art magazine at the late 1800s. And less needlework is seen in pieced cotton quilts, and applique design is less elaborate, but fine embroidery was still done in the crazy quilts as late as the 1880s and the 1890s. And then in 1890, we had the double wedding ring pattern was introduced, the bear paw and the schoolhouse blocks, and feed sacks also started to be used in piecing. So some kind of interesting things there that have to do with what we all love in our quilting. Now this one is about some more history of cotton. And in about 1880, this one is a lot about dyes, because the dyes really did a lot of changing and manufacturing in the 1800s and then on into the end of the 1900s. So in 1880, there was an unstable green that green was one of the colors that they could over dye on, and so that's why we have more prints that are green when other colors of fabrics, when we look at the 1800s, there's not as much over dyeing, meaning as much design or as much color. But green was a color that they could over dye on. But when we look at the quilts of the 1800s, it's also the green fabric that starts to shed and kind of fracture and break up. And I've got some examples of that in some quilts we're going to look at. In 1890, blue and red were still great stable colors, and they held up well over the years. We're going to look at some old quilts with the red and the blue. And then in 1890, we have dyes being made in a lab and the over dyeing process. And the pre-Civil War, a lot of the dyes were plants, and indigo was the blue, the dark blue, the indigo was very stable, and we could get that from India. So one reason why we had a lot of blue. And then the turkey red came from the bulb of a plant, and the turkey red was a very stable color. Now, they did have we talked a little bit about black dye. They did have a form of a black dye as early as 1500, but black dyes were some of the last ones to make. I talked about how that a lot of mine that are the mid-1800s up to about 1880, it really wasn't a black. It was really a dark blue, kind of a navy, and it was called a kettle black, kind of a faded antique black, and those are what a lot of my blacks are. Sometimes people say, is it navy or is it black? And so it was late 1800s before they had a true black color. Now, in 1870, we had the dyes that came from a lab, and they were not as stable, even though, because before they were like being made just, kind of at the homes, the dyes were being made from plants, and those dyes were actually more stable than the dyes that were made in a lab. And so after the Civil War, when things started becoming more manufacturing, the lab dyes were not very good, and the women longed for their fabrics that were made from the older dyes. They didn't like the new ones. And then from 1890 to 1945, dyes became more stable. And then in 1960, the dyes changed again, and they were not as stable. So if you think back, depending on how old you are, but if you think back, around the mid-1900s, maybe you can think about how clothing and things really faded, and dyed. The dye was just not as stable and as good. And then when we got to 1995, well, actually from 1970 to 1999, the dyes were better, but but not as good as they could be. And by 1995 to the year 2000, we really had a huge change with the dyes and the making of our fabrics, and they are actually the best that we've ever had. And I've talked about on my fabric how the colors are true and they're good, and they're not going to run or bleed or mess up into the other fabrics. So if you buy a premium quilt shop quality cotton, you shouldn't have any trouble with your dyes. But now remember, the different areas that you live in, the water and the chemicals in it can affect your fabric. And also, like, you could have had a quilt and you lived in Virginia and you washed it multiple times and it was fine, and then you moved to Tennessee and then you wash that quilt and it doesn't, go through the washer as well as you would have liked, and it's because of that water that changes. But also remember, when we talk about washing a quilt, I think some things that are pretty important is, of course, you can get a color fast sheet to go in your washer, which is like a dryer sheet, but it goes in the washer. And I'm trying to color catcher, that's the name of it. Yeah, color catcher. You can always put that in your quilt, and I think is great to do. But also, don't wash your quilts above 82 degrees. Anything that was alive or is alive should not be washed above 82 degrees. So that means, like, our bath water, shower water shouldn't be over 82. If you have an animal, a racehorse or whatever, you don't wash them above 82 degrees on the temperature of that. And I think, to me, the most important thing is that when you have a quilt in the washer, that you hang around that washer until it's done. Set a timer, set something on your phone or whatever, so that the minute that machine quits spinning and you can open the lid and get it out. Because when it's wet and it's been spun tight in the washer and it's compressed on each other, you could have a transfer of dye that would never have shown up if you had gotten it out of that washer immediately. So to me, that's the most important thing. Get it out immediately. Don't wash above 82 degrees, and use a color catcher. You can also, if you're a Premium Club member, you can go into the beginner section, the module there, and I have a really long informational class on dyes and colors and how to test your fabrics and all that. So when Quilt Club Week is over, or if you're Speedy Gonzalez and get through all the classes quickly, go into the beginner series in the Premium Club and look for that one on color and fabrics and textiles. You'll get some more information on how to treat your fabrics, how to test them. Because I know in our stash, we have a lot of older fabrics, and any trouble I have had with fabric bleeding over into the quilt has been from an older fabric. And so sometimes you want to test it to see what it's going to do and how it's going to react. So let's look at some of these pretty quilts that I have up here for you. And we'll talk about them, and we'll look at their colors and their dyes and how they were made, and just anything that we can learn or glean from them. So let's look down here at the table first, and we'll just kind of go through some of these. This is actually a tiny little hexie, maybe an inch. Man, I don't know if it's even that big. No, it's like a little bit bigger than a ½ inch hexie. And this was actually made, let me check my notes here. I bought it in the condition that you see it. This was made in about 1920. And of course, it has pink and blue because you would want your quilt to be used for multiple babies. And while you were making the quilt, you wouldn't know if it was a boy or a girl. So she pieced all these beautiful little hexie flowers. You can see how the cheddar was very good in the quilt. It's the one that's held up the most, and you'll see a lot of cheddar in the 1800 quilts. Now, these other pieces of fabric did not hold up well. This little blue one here did pretty well, and here. So it was one of the best fabrics. A lot of them have just completely worn away, not only the color but the fabric, and it's actually the batting that you see coming through. It's really soft and cozy. It would be great to wrap a baby up in and hold them and snuggle with them. I just loved, can just visualize that and feel that. It's a great one. Now, she didn't finish it out with the little hexes going all the way to the end or stop it, and she didn't do the binding as it being a curly edge. She added these 3 borders to it, and since it's starting to wear away, her sewing and everything is still intact. It's great. It's the actual fabrics that are showing the wear and evaporating from the quilt. But she put this, I don't know if she sewed her border together and then laid this on top, but this is actually appliqued around on the edge. You can see how the border stops underneath there. So this was actually placed on top of the border, and possibly the batting back underneath there too. Maybe she used the batting as her big piece and then laid all of this on the batting to help stabilize it. Well, we'll never know. But the binding, I think, is the original binding. It's the same color, and hand quilted. Just a beautiful little quilt. What a sweet little baby quilt. Makes you wonder about these little babies and if they grew up to have a happy life and all that. So many babies didn't make it. Now this one here is kind of a turkey tracks. It's a little bit like our star flower. If you can visualize, see, these were all diamonds they had to put in. It was set in pieces, and all of this would have been a nightmare block to make. But when I look at it, it's just our star flower. So this,
can you go to the next one?
So this is the option 10. You can see that as a, I'm sorry, option 11. And then this just is fine geese. So this is starflower in our patterns and the way that we put it together. Notice the green dye. Notice how it is overprinted. It's got your dark green for your background, then another green, then that little gold. And look how it's not faded or anything. Look how stable this one was in the printing of it.
Almost reacts like a check.
Yes, in the screen it almost does kind of look like a check. And this quilt was about 1870, and of course all hand done. Now, and just scrap, but notice how they organized their scraps. You know, this one has 2 colors. This one has 2. They used 2 colors of scraps for each block. And in the border, a lot of times in the 1800s, you do not see a pieced border. This is very unusual. Their blocks normally just went right to the edge. And I also want you to notice how wide the border is. So it almost makes me think that it was a quilt that was made in the South, because they had those big, wide sashings in between the blocks. But here you can see this border, and you could do this as an option 7. Just an option 7 here like this, but she really went into some detail to get this pieced border on here and did a very nice job on it. And when I look at on the back, her seam allowances on all of her pieces are just right on. They're all pretty much equal and the same. So don't know why the quilt never got quilted. I've thought about having it hand quilted, but I may just leave it in the form that it's in. A beautiful quilt and a nice replica of colors, and it's just you know, since it wasn't quilted, it hasn't been used, and it was stored in a chest, so it's in really great shape. Now this one is a family quilt. This one came from one of my great grandmothers. And of course quilts were just scraps, but I want you to notice once again how she organized her colors. So this is the center of the quilt, and it has the oranges. She knew she didn't have very much of that, so put it in the center, and then just went out each time with color. And this is kind of a trip around the world. The colors and the squares just kind of circle around. And when I looked here on the, and this is obviously, this was made over time. This, you know, is some older fabric, maybe late 1800s here, with some newer fabrics that, you know, maybe came from 1910 or 1920, like this. So, you know, this was a quilt that was worked on for a very long time. And when I looked over at the back, and I noticed here on this one how she used 2 pieces of fabric to get a piece large enough. Her stitches were pretty large. I know that she worked on this one later in her life, and so the stitching was not as fine as some of her earlier quilts were, but she still enjoyed her color and her design, and she just used up what she had. And here you can see, where there's two pieces of fabric that have come together to make this square large enough, two pieces of fabric that have come together here to make this square large enough. So, the motto was make do, use it up, or do without. And quilting was always made from scraps. Very seldom was there fabric that was bought for it, unless it was something that was going to be a very fine thing in your home. And of course, garments were made from the fabric, and then the leftovers went into the quilt. Now, this is a little bit of a friendship block. This is one that they would put together and sign, and I have another one down in here that I'm going to show you that's a friendship block. Now, this one, in the 1820 to 1880, they had a lot of different forms of pink. And I want you to notice, I think I have this one in multiple colors. If you look at this little raspberry pink here and the design, I think you'll recognize it from a lot of reproduction Civil War fabrics that we have seen different companies do over the years. When I first got this quilt and looked at it, I was like, well, this is new fabric. But this is a very common one that different factory houses have duplicated and made new fabric from. This is one that you see a lot, and here you can see the different shades of pink. Pink was very stable for them, and so pink is something that you'll see in a lot of old quilts from the 1800s. Now, once again, notice this wide sashing that she has. So most likely this is a southern quilt. Let me see. Sometimes I have a little note on them that give me some different research that I've done. All early fabrics, all from 1860, and they did call this one an album block. Now, I think that this one here could even be back as far as 1820. I think this pink one here could be even as old as 1820, because when you feel it, it has more of the feel of some of that 1820 to 1840 fabric. So this is something that she maybe...
Is that peachy or pink?
It's a pink, kind of a, you might think of it as peachy, but it is a pink. It's part of their pink. Some really pretty prints in here that would be nice to remake. Now, this one is also one that is uses the pink. I want you to look at this block and think about how we put it together. This is one of the blocks that we had, I think, in Love of Country. But see how you can put your 3 flying geese together and put your strips on the side and trim it up and have that square. And then you just take that square and repeat it 4 times, and it's much easier to put together than this way that they have. Look at the cheddar, the nice cheddar color. And this is kind of a houndstooth. And this one is really pretty. But the blocks are more, I don't know, I'd say darker. So to me, it's really crazy to go in here and use this pink sashing in here. And the pink is even like a different texture. So what I think happened on this is that these blocks were all made and maybe passed down to somebody, and then they took their fabric, their pink fabric, and used it for them, for the sashing. Now this one is also, it doesn't have batting in it. It doesn't have batting. So here you have the quilt top. Look at these beautiful prints. I just love these. So here you have the quilt top with this unusual pink fabric. And I can't even tell if that's a seam. No, that's just a wrinkle. And then look at this unusual confetti type stuff. And it even has it has a heavier texture to it. I don't even know what this is. There's no batting inside. But this is on the back, And this is just turned over and stitched down. It's not, is it even turned? Yeah, it has a little bit of turned edge here. And this is the quilt. It's just kind of like a summer quilt. So I think somebody was in some.
Is that thinner? Is that a liner?
No, it's actually heavier. Just a real unusual weave. I don't even know what it is. But could be used as a summer quilt, so it makes me think of a quilt in the South, and the bright, colorful, wider sashings is also a quilt of a South. So once you learn some different things about quilting and some different history about quilting, when you look at a quilt, you can let the quilt tell the story from the different colors, from the different way it was put together. So I kind of think this quilt was salvaged. I think someone was like, either we're going to use these blocks up and use it, or we're kind of desperate for a quilt. So let's get this put together with what we have, the best we have, so that we can use it. But I don't know after they put it together that it really had much use. But some really pretty fabrics. And then once again, look at this pink here. So we see lots of different pinks that they had in those 1800s. Even here's another. And I want you to notice that even though the blocks are all different colors, whatever color you use for your sashing, since it goes all over the quilt kind of becomes the pink quilt. So think about that when you choose your sashing, because, you know, if you use a red, it's going to become a red quilt, a pink quilt, and so on. Now this one, I don't know if you can recognize the pattern on it. This one is what I call my Grizzly Mountain. It's from about 1870 to 1880. It shows you more of these dyes that were not stable. That, look how this brown, this was green fabric actually, and look how it, you know, when the like after 1870, when the dyes became less stable, this green, look how it turned brown, and then it just shedded. And every time I handle this quilt, I just feel like I have sand on me. It just feels like there's just this layer of sand, and it's from this fabric. And a lot of these were made with walnut shells, some of them were. And so the walnut shells actually, in some of the browns or the greens, actually did a cutting on the fabrics. And the reason why they do that is because of the walnut shells that was in the dye. And then just a real loose backing here on the weave. And this quilt from 1870.
Would they have used a lighter quilt for picnics?
I suppose, you know, they used quilts for everything in their life. It was a staple. They used it for a wall if they didn't, you know, needed to separate off part of their house. Of course, they used them for warmth. Sometimes it was a burial cloth. You just wrap someone in a quilt and then bury them like that. So quilts, you know, for windows, curtains, for patchwork, for dresses, and so definitely, yeah, picnics would have worked. I'm not sure of the working class, how many went on picnics, but if you were maybe a little bit more affluent, you maybe would go on a picnic. You know, that's, you think about it, picnics is kind of a luxury, you know, to do. Yeah. Now back to this one. This one is, if you know about our Grizzly Mountain pattern and quilts that we have made, this quilt is the brainchild of it. And but the thing about this one that makes it so different is that this color here and this color here are different colors. And in both of the quilts I've made off of this, or that we've had made, I've made one and the other one I think Sherry made for me, but we used the same colors here, and it really makes the quilt look so much different. So half square triangles here, and then we use flying geese here. And if this is the same color, then it really makes it pop out. So keep looking at that. And I'm going to grab the first one we made, the red one, is we've sold all those kits, so that quilt is not here in the studio. Oh, there it is, hanging on the back wall. Okay, so I don't know if you can see this, Steve.
Sure we can.
Can we move it over a little bit? Okay, so this is our newest one, and we call it Eagle Mountain because we've used the eagle fabric, and it's the Grizzly Mountain pattern. So you can see how we've used this a different color here so that the star jumps out, and then that we kept the backgrounds consistent in the quilt. And so it really changes it up and makes it look a little bit different. And that one is Eagle Mountain. And then here let's look back down here again at the original one. I really, really like this quilt. I wished it didn't have so much, I guess I'm going to say shedding on it, make it feel so sandy. The next one is a lover's knot, and I think this is an Amish made quilt, and it's from about 1890. You can see a little bit of fading here, which makes me think that the way that it was folded, that it got some light either from a window or you know, from a house. And this one is called Lover's Knot. And it's really kind of similar to my Liz's Gift. Beautiful quilting, just exquisite, very tiny and very nice quilting. And then what they've used, it's a very thin quilt. And what they used on the back doesn't really seem like a fabric to me. It's like a real gauzy. It's like a real gauzy. And I'm not sure that if there was any batting in it, if it's still like in there. It's a real thin one, if it is. And this one is kind of unusual for 1890 because it has they had to have lots of fabric for these big solid squares in here. And all of these are the same color. So there was plenty of fabric to make the quilt. The quilt is kind of what I would call a normal bed size quilt for that time, which means they're not very big. Now this next one is a snail's tail, and this one is from, this one is actually from 1920. A lot of just two color quilts, like a yellow and background or a blue and background or a pink and background. A lot of those were 1920s. A lot of times people think of them as 30s, but those actually were in the 20s. Notice how all of them are the same. So once again, plenty of fabric to make every block. And notice on all four sides of the quilt, well, no, just on the sides, not on like the top and bottom, but on the sides, notice how it has a big wide back solid color like sashing or border on it. So it's kind of unusual the way that the blocks just stop and then you have this big plain border. Now something else on this quilt that I wanted to show you is this. See this? So I wonder if anybody knows what this is. It's stitched on with like a big basting stitch. So I'm going to tell you, I'm going to show you what would happen, and then I'm going to tell you why they did it. And actually my great aunt, who lived to be in her 90s, she's the one that actually taught me about this. And so it's kind of exciting to actually see this on an old quilt. So they would take just a solid piece of fabric, and they would fold it in half, and they would stitch it down, and then they would bring it over the edge. So this was the top of the quilt. So when you get in bed, you would grab it and pull it up to your face. And so one time, one of my most favorite things was when I would go to my great aunt's house, and we would visit a while and have some sweet tea and probably a piece of pie that she had made. And after we'd visited for a little while, she would say, "Would you like to see the quilts?" Well, of course, I was waiting for her to say that. And we would go into the back bedroom, and she would get on one end of the mattress and I would get on the other, and we would push it up against the wall. And then underneath the mattress, between the other mattress, there would be layers and layers of quilts. So that's how she stored her extra quilts. She kept them flat so they wouldn't wear out where they're folded, and they would also be protected from use, from being dirty, and protected from light coming in a window or from the light of the house. And so we would look at the quilt and she would tell me about it, and if she had any stories about them, which she always did. But then we got to this one quilt and it had this bib on it, this piece of fabric that went over the edge for about 6 or 8 or 9 inches and then back over the edge. And I said, "What is this?" I said, "Why does this quilt have this on here?" And she said, "Well, she said, "Notice how it's on there with big basting stitches?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "We would actually put those on the quilt where it went up to your face." She said, "That's where a quilt is going to get dirty or soiled or wore out." She said, "Your hands grab them. Your hands may be rough from working in the cotton field or handling the animals." And she said, "We didn't always take a bath every day." She said, "That's where it's going to get dirty." So they would grab the quilt and pull it up, and it would have that bib on it to help keep it from getting used and wore out and to help keep it clean. Then they would take those big basting stitches out and they could wash that or replace it with a new one and then put it back on the quilt. She also talked about how that, the men maybe didn't shave every day and how they had whiskers, and if they were pulling the covers up to their face or neck, that actually the whiskers would help, break those fibers on a binding, and then the binding would come off, on the quilt from the wear and tear of just everyday life, just things that we don't think about with our quilts today. So I think that's kind of a cool story about old quilts and how they were used and how they took care of them. She said, "We didn't want our quilts to wear out." She said, "We had to have them for different things." So we're going to look at some other quilts and see if we have some questions. Yes.
Which is best, hanging or machine drying your quilt?
Hanging. Well, with hanging, the quilt is going to be heavy with the batting and the fabric and everything. Cotton really, holds that fabric. So I don't know that hanging is something that I would do.
Stretch it.
Yeah, to me it would stretch them. I would, I usually just pop mine in the dryer, and once again, I pay attention. I don't over dry it. In times past, back a long time ago, they really talked about how to put your quilt in a bathtub and soak it, not to wring it, and then lay it out, lay it out in the sun, keeping animals and birds and stuff away. It was quite a process. And I did do that to some of them. And then later I was like, these quilts are just a part of everyday life. And if they get used up or wore out, then that's what they're supposed to do. In fact, I have one quilt. I posted a picture of it maybe about a year ago on my Facebook page. It was one that I called a utility quilt. And utility quilts meant you just took your scraps. You didn't really care about any, whatever, pick an easy design, make it. And then that quilt was used in the back of the car if you needed to have a picnic or wrap somebody up that was sick. I mean, the one that I have that's wearing out, and you can actually see layers of the certain triangles and stuff coming out. And it's just really special to me because it's one of the first ones I made like 40 years ago. It was a scrap utility quilt. We took it to ball games. I know the kids threw up on it a couple of times in the car. We used it. It was a part of our life. It has a lot of memories. And even though that quilt, it's still in the back of my car, and even though it's getting a lot of wear on it, I'm excited about it because it's been a part of our life and our family. So I think that's really cool. Okay, another question? No? Okay, let's look at this one here behind me. This is really a beautiful blue fabric, and this is from the 1800s, and it was an album quilt, and you could even some names are embroidered in here. Now this is as wide as the quilt got. It kind of drapes over in the back, so it was a quilt in process. This is a quilt that didn't get finished,
Where
but
are the names at?
there's a name here. Looks like Sandy or Sandra. And there's a name there. There's a name here. But it looks like maybe they had started to maybe write the name with some type of pencil, and we're going to stitch over it. And so, because there's not any stitching on the name, this one does. So where they use the pencil on it, it's, you know, over the 100+ years, it's kind of faded away. But the thing that I think that besides that it's not finished, is that I've looked at this quilt and I thought, okay, how did she put these blocks together so that you get this zigzag? And then today when I was hanging it up, I was like, oh, this must be like the bottom or the top of the quilt, because we've got these side triangle units that are usually on the side of a quilt when you put it on point, the block on point. But then when I got to looking at it, when I put it over here, I realized that this is a row. So all of this right here is a row. So just like this triangle unit she set in, and this one she set in, then this one over here she set in, and it made a strip or a row. And then these rows were put together like this, and that's how she got this zigzag going through. So I'm thinking, you know, because to set all these triangles in like that is a lot of work. And so I'm thinking, okay, how would I do it now? Because I think it's really a cool setting on how to put a block together. And then notice how this block goes through the bottom or the top of the other ones. They kind of stagger, and that makes it. So if you look at it like this, so look at it as an option 1. So here's your center square. Put your strips on the side, make it an option 1, and sew those in a section or a row. And then when you sew the rows together, you alternate them. So to get an idea of how to do that, in your volume 1 reference book, look at tumbling blocks. It's just an option 1, and those are sewn together so that they alternate. You could do that with a big block and have this really pretty setting like this. So I'm going to take some blocks and set them together like that. Now that I know this one and have figured this one out and have it in my mind, I think it would be a really cool one to do. So look for that coming up in a quilt soon. Coming to a quilt soon near you. And this fabric is really thin. It's just, you know, I can just see through it. It's just really, really thin. And it's not, you know, because it's been used, because it's not finished, it was just from that time period. It wasn't very heavy. Okay. Now this one is a really special quilt. And this one, I have never shown it in any lecture before. This quilt was made by my great-great-grandmother. And if you've read the novels, then you know a little bit about my great-great-grandmother, and that she lived to be very old, and that she made a lot of quilts in her life. And when my sisters and I went through our mother's things, there was a lot of quilts there from Granny, and they were divided up between us girls. So we each got, I think I probably have more than the other sisters, but they chose, you know, something else. So, but everybody got, I think, at least 2 quilts. Now this one is a wedding ring, and it was given to my mother as a wedding gift from her great-grandmother. And I don't think that my mother ever used it. I don't ever remember it being out when I was a little girl. I remember it always being stored in the cedar chest. And I didn't know that it was a wedding gift. I knew that Granny had made it, but I didn't know that it was a wedding gift from my mother till just a few years before she passed away. I said, Mother, I said, can we look at Granny's quilts, and can you tell me everything that you know about these quilts? Because she knew I loved the quilts and the history and everything. And so one time when I was there, she said yes, because she didn't want us to get stuff out. But she was willing that day. We got all the quilts out. We spread them on a special carpet, and so that we could look at them and talk about them. And I could write down everything that she was telling me about the quilts. So this was made by Granny. It was later in her life. She was probably in her 90s or late 90s. And I don't think my mother ever used it. And usually when a quilt, and there's no fading on it, it was kept in a trunk. And sometimes a quilt can wear where it's folded, quilt can be in really great shape, but then where it's folded, like that double X going through the middle, a plus sign, can really wear the quilt out just from the folding. But this one, you can't even see where it was folded. So it was very well taken care of. It's now 70 plus years old. And it still has a nice vibrant color to all of the fabrics. When I looked at the back of it when I was hanging it, there are some stains on it. So I know it was used a little bit, but it must have just been used early in its life. It wasn't used when I was a girl growing up. We never saw it out for use. But made from scraps. She's got some of these darker blues kind of scattered off in here. But notice how this edge here is pretty much all of that blue going along that edge. And at first I thought, well, maybe she used the darker blue around on all of it because, you know, then I saw some over here, but she didn't. It's just kind of scattered throughout the quilt, but most of it over here on this edge. So if it was going to be used, that would be nice to maybe put that along the bottom of the bed or something like that, because almost all of this side of the border is like that. It's also thick. So I'm sure it was made from the cotton in the field that they grew and harvested and worked. My mother hoed cotton fields when she was a little girl and pulled a sack of cotton to pick cotton. So I'm sure the cotton that's inside that quilt for the batting came from a cotton field that they had. And the other thing about the quilt that's really unusual is that the back of the fabric, which is just, you know, the heavy, you know, fabrics that they had, she brought it over on the edge and stitched it down. The binding is not a separate piece of fabric, it's the back that she brought over. And I think about how hard that would have been to do on this curved edge of a wedding ring, and I'm thinking, wow, she spent a lot of hours doing that on there. And this was a wedding gift for my mother. All right, I've got two more. Any questions? Okay, I've got two more quilts to show you. This first one here is an ocean wave. And the ocean wave quilt is from the 1800s and kind of the late 1800s. And this one has a lot of older fabrics in it, but when they look at a quilt today to quilt, they look to find the newest piece of fabric. And so if there's a piece of fabric from 1910 in here, even if everything else is an 1880, the quilt is going to be called a 1910 quilt. But several of the pieces of fabric are really faded out. And the quilting in here is like a double row kind of tic-tac-toe. And when I was looking at all of the half square triangles, I was looking at really what a great job this quilter did on putting all of these half square triangles together. She's got really nice sharp points. Everything is smooth and flat. I mean, she was a great quilt maker. Now, this quilt was used and it was very damaged along the outside edges. And so I couldn't, and someone had replaced the binding and used just one of those pinks like we were talking about, and it just didn't go with the quilt at all. You could tell the binding was not the original and it was just a really bad color. And so, and the edges on the quilt everywhere were really worn. So I actually went in with my rotary cutter and my ruler, and I went in and cut off all the damaged edges. I didn't really pay attention to the pattern. I wanted the quilt to look good and for me to enjoy it in a display, and I wanted a good binding put on it because the quilt was in really good shape. So I just cut off the damaged areas no matter where they were at, and then I went back in and chose a red binding because to me there's a lot of pretty red in here and the blue, and I'm a red girl, so I did a red binding, and it really brought the quilt back to life, and I really enjoy it.
The binding on that side. Go in tight.
It's got a lot of the 1800 fabrics in here. It's got the checks that we talked about from 1850, the stable reds and blues. It's got a little bit of more black in here, so definitely late 1800s. Just really a pretty quilt. And it has kind of an unusual back on it. It's got just, I can't tell if it's really faded or if it was more red and black and it's just faded out. And the batting is really thin and consistent through the quilt. A lot of the old quilts have that real chunky batting in it, kind of like the wedding ring one. Okay, now the last one is a two-color quilt, and it shows the eagle, just a simple design. So this one was, I'm going to guess and say about 1930. I know I had a quilt historian look at it and give me some information, and now I can't remember what she told me or where I put it. But this, I think, is about 1920. It's the colors of that. It's the two tones. Remember, the snail's tail was 1920. It's quilted in yellow, and it's probably about 1.5 inches, 2-inch crosshatch going through there, and applique eagle with the stars that go around, the ornate down at the bottom, and those are also up at the top, and then the banner with the stars that goes along in the border. And this is a separate piece, so she cut this like at 9 inches or whatever, and then she appliqued this on here and then sewed it onto the quilt. It was not all one big whole cloth where she put this on, which I think that's pretty interesting. I would do it that way, but I don't know that everyone back in the day would have done it that way or not. Okay, do we have any questions or comments? I hope you guys are enjoying Quilt Club Week. Anything that you really enjoyed in the classes that you watched today? Did you get to watch polka dot quilting, or the beginning of Missy's Ashton quilt? If you have any questions or comments on anything, okay. So I hope you guys are getting up and walking around every once in a while and stretching those muscles out, not just binge watching and glued to whatever it is that you're watching. And don't forget to stop and get a snack every once in a while. And we will see you at 8 o'clock in the morning for our live and for the opening of the second day of classes, which is actually day 3 of Quilt Club Week. I'll go back in and look at comments and monitor some of the online stuff. And if you need any help or have any questions, just let us know. If you have questions about finding something, it's really best to send that in an email so that Steve can help you and keep track and make sure that he can direct you where you need to go. But hopefully everyone that's watching is getting in and everything is fine. It's just our normal portal and modules. And you're getting email notifications with some links on them too. Okay? Enjoy your day, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye for now.